It's 5 in the morning, not your modern 5 a.m., where you might still be scrolling through your phone, but a medieval 5 a.m., where the only notification you hear is a rooster screaming into the cold, gray air. There's no alarm clock to snooze, no soft mattress to roll over on, and definitely no blanket made of cotton or fleece. You're sleeping on a sack filled with straw that smells faintly like damp earth and cow dot. As the rooster cries again, you realize there's no escaping the day ahead. You're a peasant in the 14th century, somewhere in rural Europe, and every single morning begins the same way. Dark, cold, and heavy. You pull yourself from the straw, scratching the flea bites on your arms. The hut around you is silent, except for the faint sound of your family breathing, your wife, your children, and maybe even a pig that sleeps inside for warmth. There's no separate room, no privacy, just one smoky wooden room that's both home and prison. The air is thick with the scent of soot and manure. You stretch, trying not to hit your head on the low ceiling beams. There's frost on the inside of the window. Yes, inside, and your breath looks like mist. You might think about starting a fire, but that requires wood, and wood costs money, and money, well, that's something you haven't seen in months. The first task of the day isn't breakfast, it's survival. You pull on your only set of clothes, the same ones you wore yesterday and the day before that, and maybe for the last 6 months. They're made of coarse wool, itchy against the skin, and so thick they trap every smell. The mud on your boots from last week, still there. Outside, the village is quiet, except for the occasional barking of a dog or the creak of a distant cartwheel. The sky is still half dark, painted with the pale blue of dawn. You can smell the wet hay, the cold smoke, and the faint metallic scent of the nearby blacksmith's forge. There's no weekend, no holidays, no personal time. If you're lucky, you get a half day off on Sunday, but even that might be spent mending tools, repairing roofs, or preparing for the next grueling week. And if you think your boss is strict, try having God as your boss. Every moment of your life is a cycle of prayer, fear, and labor. Now, imagine you were born a peasant, which, statistically, you almost certainly would have been. Over 90% of the population in medieval Europe lived this way. Your job, working the land owned by your lord, not your land, his. You wake before the sun, plow fields you don't own, grow food you don't get to keep, and pay taxes you can barely afford if you refuse to work. The punishment isn't a warning, it's starvation. There's no unemployment benefit, no safety net, and no labor union. Your day begins with a simple meal, if you can call it that. A crust of stale bread soaked in watered-down ale. Water isn't safe to drink, so even children drink beer, weak, cloudy, and sour. The bread is so hard that some people dunk it in broth just to soften it. Butter, cheese, or meat are luxuries reserved for the Lord's table. You might whisper a prayer before eating, though it's more out of fear than gratitude. After all, sin is everywhere, even in thoughts. The church says you must fear temptation, obey your Lord, and accept your suffering as part of God's plan. That's comforting. In a terrible sort of way, by sunrise, the fields are alive with movement. Men carry wooden plows pulled by oxen. Women gather herbs or spin wool, and children chase chickens or haul buckets from the well. There's no childhood in the medieval world, just smaller. Workers with dirtier hands. The Lord's manor stands at a distance. A stone building towering above your thatched huts. A reminder of who owns you without ever needing to say it. You might glance at it once, but not for too long. Even looking too proud could be seen as disrespectful. The air fills with the sound of iron striking stone, of cartwheels rolling, of people coughing, always coughing. There's a constant background of sickness here. The Black Death hasn't come yet, but disease is everywhere. No one really understands why they think it's God's punishment, or maybe bad air, or evil spirits. So you live in fear of everything. Hunger, sin, illness, and your Lord's anger. By midday, the sun is high and hot, but you don't rest. Lunch is more bread, maybe an onion, or, if you're lucky, a bowl of thick porridge. You eat with your hands sitting on the ground, and talk little, because in the Middle Ages, silence was safety if you complained. Someone might tell the priest, who might tell the Lord, and suddenly you're rebelling. People have been flogged or worse for less. Sometimes you hear rumors of distant wars, of kings dying, of lands changing hands, but they feel like stories from another planet. You are too busy keeping yourself alive to care about who sits on the throne. When evening comes, you return home exhausted. Your back aches, your hands are cracked, and your stomach is still half empty. The world grows quiet again, except for the croak of frogs and the whisper of the wind through the trees. You sit near the dim fire, your family huddled close. You might tell a story, not for fun, but to remind yourself that there's something beyond the pain of today. Stories of knights, saints, and miracles. Stories of heaven. Stories that make the dark a little less heavy. And then, as the last sparks fade, you crawl back into your straw bed. The fleas bite, the wood creaks, and the cold presses against your bones. You close your eyes, knowing tomorrow will be the same. But still, there's something strangely peaceful about it. A simple rhythm of life and suffering. A heartbeat of history that no one remembers. Narration, ending line. So next time you complain about your 9-to-5 job, just remember, at least your alarm clock isn't a rooster screaming you into another day of medieval misery. The first light of morning has settled across the muddy village. Smoke rises lazily from a few chimneys, curling into the gray sky like ghosts that never learned to leave. You stretch your stiff limbs and think of one thing: breakfast. But breakfast, as you know it today, toast, coffee, maybe eggs, doesn't exist here. There's no coffee to wake you up, no milk in the jug, no sweet fruit waiting on the table. In the Middle Ages, breakfast isn't about taste, it's about survival. You reach for a loaf of yesterday's bread, hard as a rock, dark as soil, and so tough that you could probably use it as a weapon. This bread isn't made from soft white flour. That's for the rich. Yours is made from rye, barley, and sometimes ground beans or acorns when times are bad. Each bite feels like a challenge. You break it apart, dip it into a wooden bowl filled with ale, weak, cloudy, and sour. It's not really for the flavor. It's because water could kill you. In medieval Europe, clean water was a fantasy. Wells were often shallow, rivers were shared with animals, and waste ran wherever it pleased. People didn't understand bacteria. They just knew that water made people sick. So, they boiled it with grain, fermented it a little, and called it beer. Even children drank it. not to get drunk, just to stay alive. So, every morning, peasants sipped warm, bitter ale like you'd sip coffee today. And somehow, that was comforting. If you were lucky enough to live near a monastery, you might get better quality ale, thick, golden, brewed by monks who took pride in their craft. But for most peasants, beer was homemade, cloudy, and had the flavor of wet hay and smoke. Still, it kept the thirst away. You sit near the fire, holding the cup in your rough, cracked hands. The smell of smoke fills your nose, and your stomach growls. You think of meat, salted pork, roasted chicken, anything, but that's a luxury you might see once or twice a year, maybe at Christmas or a wedding feast for the poor. Daily meals were a monotonous rotation of bread and pottage, a thick stew made from whatever you could find, cabbage, onions, leeks, and maybe a few beans or lentils if you were lucky. It simmered slowly over the fire, sometimes for days, each meal just a reheated version of yesterday's. And if you had no food left, you just drank more ale and pretended to be full. Outside, the sound of the village grows louder. The blacksmith's hammer, the bleating of goats, the chatter of women fetching water. You can smell the damp earth mixed with smoke and livestock. The baker's hut sends out the sweetest scent in the village, warm, comforting, almost holy. But for most peasants, that's a cruel tease. Bread from the baker is expensive. You make your own in a small clay oven, baking rough loaves once every few days. Sometimes you burn them. Sometimes they're undercooked. Either way, you eat them. And if the harvest was bad, you might mix sawdust or ground weeds into the dough to make it stretch further. Now imagine you're halfway through your loaf and you bite down, crunch. It's not a crust, it's a pebble. That's because medieval grain mills were primitive. Tiny bits of stone often ended up in the flour. Over time, those grains of grit wore down people's teeth until they cracked and decayed. By age 30, most peasants had mouths full of pain and infection. Yet no one complained. Pain was normal. By mid-morning, you finish your humble meal. The children lick their fingers, their faces smudged with ash. The air inside your hut is heavy with smoke from the fire. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof. The walls are blackened, and the air burns your throat. But you stay close to the fire anyway, because outside, it's still cold. There's no insulation, no glass windows, no heating except for that single fire. Sometimes, the smoke gets so thick, your eyes water constantly. Historians say medieval homes had some of the worst indoor air quality in history. But to you, that's just home. Then there's the constant background hum of hunger. Even when your belly feels full, it's never satisfied. Bread and ale fill space, but they don't nourish much. The calories are low and the nutrition poorer. Your body aches for meat, for fat, for something rich. But those foods belong to the upper classes. You work their land. You raise their livestock, but you can't eat from it. The chickens in your yard, the lords, the milk from your cow, the tithe collectors, even the grain from your field. You owe a portion to the church. So, the average peasant ate what was left, scraps, roots, and dreams. Let's say you're one of the rare few who lives near a forest. You might sneak out to hunt a rabbit or gather wild herbs, but be careful. Poaching was a crime. The forest belonged to the Lord, and catching his deer could get you whipped, branded, or even hanged. So you wait for luck. Maybe a squirrel, maybe a pigeon, something small enough to roast over your fire. But most days, there's nothing. Just bread, just beer, just hunger. And yet, somehow, people found joy in small things. A shared loaf with neighbors. The laughter of children chasing chickens through mud. The warmth of a fire after a freezing morning in a world of endless labor. These tiny comforts were treasures. Now imagine you're a noble, sitting high in your stone castle. Your breakfast looks very different. White bread, a silver goblet of spiced wine. You dine on what peasants could only dream of, but you're not entirely better off. Your food might be richer, but it's also riskier. Meat rots quickly without refrigeration, and spices were expensive imports. Nobles often drowned their food in salt or vinegar to hide the taste of decay. Their kitchens were filled with rats, smoke, and servants who didn't always wash their hands. So while peasants suffered hunger, nobles suffered indigestion, a different kind of misery. The medieval diet was a reflection of the world itself, harsh, unequal, and fragile. One bad harvest could mean starvation. A flood, a drought, or a swarm of locusts could erase months of work. And there was no supermarket to restock from. If the village ran out of food, people ate grass, bark, or boiled weeds. Some even ground bones into powder for bread. Famine wasn't rare, it was expected. Every few years, nature reminded humanity who was in charge. By noon, the sun is higher now, and the village hums with movement. You wipe crumbs from your tunic, grab your wooden hoe, and head toward the fields. Your stomach is half full, your mind half awake. The day will be long, plowing, hauling, sweating, and by evening, you'll come home to the same meal again, but you don't question it. You don't dream of escape. In this world, stability, even miserable stability, is a kind of peace. You've seen hunger. You've seen neighbors starve. You've buried children in the cold earth. So, if you have bread and beer today, you're luckier than most. There's a strange beauty in that thought. The medieval peasant, sitting by the fire, sipping bitter ale, is not thinking of progress or politics. He's thinking only of tomorrow's bread, and that, perhaps, is why history calls these times dark. Not because there was no light, but because there was no time to look up and see it. Narration, ending line. So next time you skip breakfast, remember, at least you're not soaking rock-hard bread in warm beer just to survive another dawn. You've survived another medieval morning, somehow. You've eaten your bread, drunk your beer, and worked half the day in the mud. Now, imagine this. You're sweating, filthy, and covered in dust and animal hair. What do you do next? Probably nothing. Because in the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't a daily habit. It was a luxury, sometimes even a sin. The dirt that defined an era cleanliness as we know it today didn't exist. Soap was rare, water was risky, and privacy was impossible. Most peasants went months without a proper wash. They wiped their faces with rough cloths, maybe rinsed their hands before eating, and that was it. The idea of washing your whole body every day, that was something only the rich or the foolish would do. People believed, too. Much bathing could open the pores and let in disease. The church even preached modesty in cleanliness. If you washed too often, you might be accused of vanity. So, in a strange twist of faith and fear, people decided to simply live in their own dirt. When bathhouses were beautiful and dangerous, but not everyone avoided baths. In medieval towns, there were public bathhouses, steamy rooms filled with wooden tubs, hot water, and chatter. At first, they were wholesome places for families. People came to relax, eat, and talk. But over time, those same bathhouses earned a darker reputation. Many turned into secret meeting spots, places of pleasure, gossip, and sin. As plagues began spreading through Europe, the church declared bathhouses immoral, and one by one they closed. So, by the 15th century, entire generations forgot what a proper bath even felt like. The peasant's bathroom in your little village hut. There's no bathroom, not even a bucket inside. You relieve yourself outside in a pit behind the house. Or, if it's freezing, maybe in a wooden pot you later empty into the ditch. The streets are lined with waste. Human waste, animal waste. Everything flows together. Rain carries it down toward the river. The same river where you fetch water and wash your clothes. The smell. Imagine rotten eggs, manure, and smoke mixed together. That was medieval perfume. In cities, it's even worse. People threw chamber pot contents right out of upper floor windows. If you were unlucky enough to be walking underneath, well, you'd learn quickly to listen for the warning shout, Gardelou. It meant, look out below. Medieval beauty secrets sound yet. People still cared in their own way. Peasant women combed their hair with bone or wooden combs, rubbed ashes into their scalps to absorb grease, and braided it tightly to hide the dirt. Men trimmed beards with knives, not razors. Those who could afford it used strange cosmetics, lard mixed with herbs, crushed eggshell for toothpaste, even vinegar as deodorant. It didn't work well, but it made them feel cleaner. Diseases everywhere still. Dirt brought consequences. With poor sanitation came fleas, lice, and rats, the true rulers of medieval life. Fleas lived in your straw mattress, in your clothes, even in your hair. When they bit you, you scratched until the skin bled. Lice nested in your seams and collars. You couldn't escape them. Everyone had them, from peasants to kings. And then there were the rats, always watching, always feeding. They thrived in the filth, crawling through barns, kitchens, and bedrooms. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, the fleas on those rats carried death across continents. Whole villages vanished. Entire families were gone overnight. They didn't understand why. Some blamed witches, others demons, and many believed God was punishing mankind. No one suspected the humble flea medicine, or madness if you fell sick. There were no hospitals, at least not as we know them. You went to the local wise woman, the priest, or the barber surgeon, a man who cut hair and performed surgery. The cure for nearly every illness began with one idea: let the bad blood out. Barber surgeons used leeches or knives to balance the humors. People were bled for headaches, fevers, sadness, even for toothaches. And if you were too weak afterward, they said, then the sickness must have been strong. The smell of death, the stench of medieval towns, was unforgettable, a mixture of animals, humans, and decay. In summer, it clung to your skin. In winter, it froze into the air. The dead were buried quickly, often shallow, sometimes in mass graves. Graveyards overflowed, and new ones were built right beside homes. Disease lingered like fog. People burned herbs to cleanse the air. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, anything with a strong scent. It didn't kill germs, but it made the smell bearable. Monks, miracles, and medicine inside monasteries. Things were a little better. Monks kept herbal gardens, growing plants like sage, chamomile, and mint. They recorded cures in manuscripts, blending observation with prayer. They made sabustis and ointments that sometimes worked, not because of miracles, but because of experience. Still, medicine was half science, half superstition. If someone had epilepsy, priests said demons caused it. If someone had plague, they blamed bad air, miasma. Masks filled with herbs became the first protective gear, and doctors dressed like crows. It looked terrifying, but it saved some lives. Life expectancy and resilience. You might wonder, how long did people live like this? Most peasants never reached 40. Childbirth was deadly. Wounds got infected. A cold could turn fatal. And yet, life went on. Every spring, fields were plowed again. Every Sunday, church bells rang again. People fell in love, had children, told stories, and laughed despite everything. Because even in the filth and fear, the human spirit refused to die. The quiet of the night by nightfall, the village sleeps. The fire crackles low, the air heavy with smoke and the scent of sweat. You lie down on your straw bed again, scratching at a flea bite, listening to the faint cough of someone next door. And yet you feel a strange peace. The stars above are brighter than any city sky. The world is silent, simple, and small. You don't think about germs or hygiene. You think about surviving another day. Narration ending line. So next time you complain about your shower water being too cold, remember, in the Middle Ages, even touching clean water was an act of faith. Morning mist still clings to the fields, heavy and cold, like a ghost that refuses to leave. You wake up before the sun, not because you want to, but because, in the medieval world, life doesn't wait for anyone. There's no clock to tell you it's early. The rooster's cry and the ache in your bones are all the reminders you need. Your back throbs from yesterday's endless labor. Your hands are cracked and sore, and your stomach growls even before you move. You step outside your tiny wooden hut, feeling the cold soil under your bare feet, and you already know what your day will bring. More work, more sweat, more survival. The village smells of damp earth, wood smoke, and animals. The air is thick and heavy, but the silence of dawn is quickly broken by distant sounds of tools, hooves, and human sighs. You're a peasant, a serf, a farmer, whatever the Lord chooses to call you. You don't own your land. You work it. You're bound to it. Born into this life, just as your parents were, and your children will be. You owe your Lord labor and taxes, not in coins, but in sweat and harvest. Whatever grows from your field isn't yours alone. Part of it belongs to Him, part to the church, and only what's left will feed your family. The fields stretch endlessly, and so does your labor. From sunrise to sunset, the earth demands everything you have. You use a wooden plow, drawn by a slow, heavy ox. The mud pulls at your legs as you walk behind it, guiding the blade through the stubborn soil. The air smells of iron, earth, and effort. There's no music except for the creak of wood, the grunt of the ox, and the beating of your heart. You work with hope, hope that rain will come, that blight won't strike, that the Lord won't raise taxes again. But hope is as fragile as the crops you grow. One bad storm, one long drought, and everything could vanish. There are no weekends, no holidays, no concept of leisure. Your only rest comes from holy days, church festivals that let you stop working. But even then, rest is an illusion. You spend the day mending fences, fixing tools, or helping your neighbors rebuild what the wind or rain destroyed. You sleep when you can, eat when you must, and pray always, because in your world, faith is the only thing stronger than hunger. Your tools are primitive wooden handles, dull iron blades, things that splinter, rust, or break. You don't complain because there's no one to complain to. The seasons are your masters. Spring demands plowing and planting. Summer burns your skin as you harvest under the sun. Autumn makes you sough again, racing against the cold. Winter freezes your hands and your breath, leaving you to pray that what you've stored will last until the thaw. Each day repeats the last, and each year feels the same. Your day begins before dawn. You eat a scrap of bread, maybe an onion or a sip of ale. You step into the field while the stars are still fading, and you don't stop until the sun sinks again. By midday, your body feels like stone. By nightfall, it feels like death. But you keep moving because stopping is not an option. If you fall behind, your crops fail. If your crops fail, your family starves. And if your family starves, the Lord still takes his share in the village. Others work too, not all in the fields, but none any freer. The blacksmith hammers iron in his smoky forge, shaping nails and horseshoes, his face black with soot. The tanner soaks hides in foul-smelling vats, the stench so strong that no one lives nearby. The miller grinds the grain, always suspected of taking a little extra for himself. Everyone toils, everyone struggles, but no one gets rich. The taxes never stop. Whatever little you earn, someone always takes a piece. The Lord demands his share. The king demands his due. The church demands its tithe, 10% of everything, even if it means less food for your children. Refuse to pay, and you risk losing everything, including your soul. The priest reminds you every Sunday that God loves the obedient, so you obey. You kneel, you pray, and you keep your head down, because questioning the system is not just rebellion, it's sin. Injuries are common. A slipped plow blade, a broken leg, a deep cut, any of these can end your life. There are no doctors, only herbs and hope. A wound that doesn't heal becomes an infection becomes death. There's no compensation, no help, no mercy. If you can't work, you beg. If you can't beg, you die quietly, like thousands of others who came before you. Death is part of the rhythm of the land, and everyone learns to live beside it. When evening comes, the sky turns gold, then red, then black. The field glows faintly in the fading light, and for a moment, you stop to look at it, not because you want to, but because your body can't move anymore. You take a breath, your hands trembling, your skin covered in dust and sweat. You know you'll be back tomorrow, doing the same thing. You think about your family, waiting in the hut, and the smell of thin stew cooking over a weak fire pulls you home. Inside, the hut is dim and smoky. The floor is dirt, the walls rough. The only light comes from a dying fire and the faint glow of embers. Your children are asleep already, curled beside a pig for warmth. You eat slowly, a bowl of pottage, maybe bread if you're lucky. The food is bland but filling. You stare into the fire as it flickers, listening to the quiet breathing of your family. Outside, the wind howls through the trees, whispering reminders that tomorrow will be the same in this world. Rest is not luxury, it's mercy. You close your eyes and let your body sink into the straw. For a few moments, the pain fades and sleep takes you. But even in dreams, the sound of the plow and the weight of duty remain. The land doesn't forget you, and it doesn't forgive you either. Yet, despite it all, life goes on. The peasants laugh when they can. They sing after harvests, dance barefoot in the mud during festivals, and hold each other close when winter comes. They have almost nothing, but that little means everything. Their strength isn't in their freedom, it's in their endurance. So when you think your modern job is hard, imagine this: waking before dawn every day, working till moonlight, eating barely enough to live, and doing it all again without complaint. No weekends, no wages, no freedom, just survival, quiet, brutal, and endless. That was the life of a medieval laborer, a life you probably wouldn't survive for even a single day. In the medieval world, justice was not blind, it was brutal, public, and unforgettable. The idea of fairness existed mostly in name, but what people truly believed in was fear. Fear kept order. Fear kept peasants in line. Fear made kings powerful. When someone broke the law, the punishment wasn't meant to correct them. It was meant to remind everyone else of what could happen if they dared to do the same. In a time without police, without prisons like today, justice came in the form of spectacle. Imagine walking into the village square on a cloudy morning. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and something metallic. People gather in silence, some curious, others trembling. The church bell rings, not for prayer, but for punishment. At the center of the square stands a wooden scaffold, rough and splintered, stained with dark marks that never quite wash away. Beside it, the executioner waits, his face hidden beneath a hood. His hands rest on an axe that gleams coldly in the light. Children cling to their mothers. The criminal may be a thief, may be a liar, maybe just someone who spoke against the wrong person, is dragged forward in chains. There's no lawyer, no jury, no appeal. The Lord has spoken. The sentence must be carried out. In those days, justice was simple and terrifyingly creative. A peasant who stole bread could have his hand cut off because that hand was the instrument of the crime. A woman accused of gossiping about her neighbor might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, a metal cage that locked around her head with a sharp plate pressing down on her tongue. The pain was one thing, but the humiliation was worse. People would point, laugh, and throw scraps of garbage at her as she was paraded through the streets. When the punishment ended, her spirit rarely did. The belief that pain could purify the soul was powerful. The church often supported torture, claiming it brought confession and repentance. Interrogations were not about discovering truth. They were about forcing it out, no matter what. The rack, for instance, was a favorite in Europe. A simple wooden frame with ropes and rollers. It stretched the victim's limbs until the joints popped and bones snapped. The longer you denied your guilt, the tighter they pulled. In the end, everyone confessed. It didn't matter if you were innocent. By the time the screams stopped, the truth didn't matter anymore. For smaller crimes, there were smaller but equally cruel punishments. The stocks were common, a wooden device with holes for your hands and head, where you'd be locked for hours or days. People would throw food, mud, or worse. There was no dignity left, no escape from the eyes of your neighbors. It was the medieval version of public shaming, and it worked. Everyone remembered your face. Everyone remembered your sin. But for greater crimes, treason, murder, heresy, the punishments grew darker. Execution was a show. It was meant to draw a crowd, to satisfy a deep, unspoken hunger for justice and horror. Hanging was common, but it wasn't always quick. Ropes broke. Necks didn't snap. Sometimes people dangled for minutes, gasping and twitching, while the crowd watched in uneasy silence. The bravest executioners gave mercy by pulling the legs to hasten death. The cruelest just watched. Beheading was reserved for the noble, a clean death, or so they said. But even that could go wrong. A dull axe or a shaky hand could turn it into a nightmare. There are stories of executioners needing 3, even 4 blows to finish the job. The crowd would flinch, but the sentence had to be carried out. Death was not the point, the message was. And then there were the burnings, the fire that purifies, the flame that consumes the wicked. Heretics and witches met their end that way, tied to a stake, surrounded by wood, while priests read prayers over the crackling fire. Smoke filled the sky, the crowd crossed themselves, and the screams mingled with hymns. People said it was justice. People said it was holy. But when the wind carried the smell of burnt flesh over the fields, even the most faithful looked away. Medieval justice had its tools, each designed not just to punish, but to terrify. The Iron Maiden, a coffin-shaped chamber lined with spikes, though mostly legend, reflected how people imagined their rulers could punish them. The pillory, where your body was exposed in the market square. The dunking stool, where accused witches or scolding women were tied to a chair and dunked repeatedly into freezing water. If you drowned, you were innocent. If you survived, you were guilty and burned. Logic had no place here. Faith ruled everything, even cruelty. In some towns, the executioner was both feared and pitied. He lived apart from others, often near the gallows, never fully part of society. Children whispered about him. Adults avoided his gaze. Yet everyone needed him. He was the hand of justice, silent, precise, inevitable. When he sharpened his blade, people crossed themselves. When he walked through the market, the noise died. Some said he was cursed. Some said he was blessed. But all agreed he was necessary. Torture wasn't only about punishment. It was also about control. When kings wanted obedience, when priests wanted confession, when nobles wanted revenge, pain was the language they spoke. The dungeon became their courtroom, the whip their law. Prisoners were chained in darkness for days, sometimes weeks, fed just enough to keep them alive. Rats, cold stone, dripping water, that was their world. And in that world, truth lost all meaning. You said what your captors wanted to hear, because silence hurt too much. The strange thing was how ordinary people accepted it. For them, it was justice. They believed every punishment, no matter how cruel, was part of God's will. The same hands that worked the fields by day could throw stones at a condemned thief by night. It wasn't evil, it was survival. In a world where life was short and power absolute, the only way to stay safe was to stay silent. But not everyone stayed silent. There were rebels, heretics, and thinkers who challenged the system. They questioned the church, mocked the nobles, or demanded change. Most of them met their end in fire or chains. Yet their defiance planted seeds, ideas that centuries later would grow into revolutions. But back then, in the thick of the Middle Ages, hope was as dangerous as sin. By evening, after an execution, the square would return to normal. Merchants sold bread, children played, dogs fought over scraps. The scaffold still stood, the ground still stained, but life went on. The people had seen death, but they had also seen order restored. Fear had done its job again. Tomorrow, they would rise, work the fields, and whisper prayers that they'd never find themselves on that platform. And if you lived in that time, you would have done the same. Because in a world where justice wore an iron mask, survival meant obedience. Speaking the wrong word could mean the lash. Stealing could mean the noose. Disobedience could mean the flame. You wouldn't have lasted a day, not because you were weak, but because mercy wasn't part of medieval law. Night falls on the village, and the silence after punishment is heavier than the screams that came before. The executioner's hood hangs by his bed, the axe cleaned, the blood washed away. The priest prays in candlelight, asking forgiveness for what he has blessed. The peasants sleep uneasily, their dreams filled with smoke and fire. Somewhere, an owl cries in the dark, a lonely echo in a world that believes pain brings peace, and so it continues. Justice by fear, order through suffering, a system that kept itself alive through the pain of its people. The medieval mind didn't see cruelty, it saw necessity. Without it, they believed, chaos would consume the world. So they built their peace on pain, their laws on terror, and their faith on the screams of the condemned. That was justice in the Middle Ages, raw, merciless, and unforgettable. The world had always smelled of earth, smoke, and sweat, but when the plague came, it smelled of death. It started quietly, like a rumor carried on the wind, whispers of sickness from faraway towns, of carts filled with bodies, of priests who stopped ringing the bells because there were too many to bury. In the medieval world, people had seen famine and war, but nothing like this. This was different. This was invisible. It moved like a shadow, faster than armies, stronger than kings. It came in the year 1347, though some say it began long before, in the east, in the dust of trade routes carried by rats and ships and breath. At first, they called it the pestilence, later the Black Death. Imagine waking one morning to the sound of silence, no laughter, no market noise, just the hollow echo of fear. The streets that once overflowed with life now stood empty, doors barred, candles flickering behind shuttered windows. The church bells never stopped, ringing day and night to mark the dead. Graves filled so fast that the ground itself seemed to breathe with rot. The smell carried through the air, a heavy, sweet, unbearable odor that clung to your clothes and your soul. People walked with herbs pressed to their noses, believing the scent would protect them. Doctors wore long, bird-like masks stuffed with spices, their black robes making them look more like death's servants than healers. The symptoms came without mercy. First, a fever, then chills, then the swellings, great black buboes that grew under the arms, in the groin, on the neck. They burned and throbbed until the skin split. The blood turned dark, the breath grew shallow, and within days, the body gave up. Some said it was punishment for sin. Others said it was poison in the air, spread by bad winds or foreign traders. A few whispered that it was the end of days, and maybe, for them, it was. The plague didn't care who you were. It took peasants and nobles alike. Kings locked themselves in castles, but the rats found them too. Priests prayed over corpses until they fell beside them. Mothers buried children in shallow graves, only to be buried by strangers days later. Entire families vanished, their names erased in a single week. Villages were left empty, fields untended, livestock wandering freely through towns that had no one left to claim them. The world had stopped breathing. In some cities, fear turned to madness. People blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells, and entire communities were burned alive in desperate, cruel attempts to stop what they didn't understand. Others joined flagellant groups, men who whipped themselves bloody through the streets, begging God to forgive the world. The sight of them became common. Long lines of half-naked bodies, chanting, crying, striking themselves with ropes tipped in iron until the ground ran red. But forgiveness never came. The plague didn't care for penance. It just kept moving. There was no cure, no medicine, no hope. The doctors of the age were powerless. They tried bloodletting, leeches, potions, even charms carved with strange words. Some carried gemstones, believing they could absorb the sickness. Others fled to the countryside, only to carry the disease with them. Towns closed their gates. Ships were turned away from ports. Quarantine was born from those days, 40 days of isolation for every vessel, though often it wasn't enough. Death traveled faster than the rules could follow, and yet the human instinct to survive never died. Gravediggers worked through the night, their faces wrapped in cloth, their shovels cutting into the soft, endless earth. Priests performed last rites from a distance, muttering prayers through tears. Painters recorded the horror in illuminated manuscripts, tiny figures of angels and demons filling the margins, as if art itself could make sense of what was happening. In monasteries, monks wrote that the world was ending, and when they died, their ink dried with them. The scale of death was beyond imagination. In some places, half the population vanished. In others, cities that once held tens of thousands were reduced to ghosts. The living envied the dead, and the dead outnumbered the living. But when the worst of it finally passed, when the air began to clear and the bells rang less often, what remained was not the same world as before. The Black Death had changed everything. With so many gone, the old order began to crumble. Lords found their fields empty, their workers dead or missing. The peasants who survived suddenly had power. They were needed, and they knew it. Wages rose, feudal bonds weakened, and for the first time in centuries, the lower classes began to dream of more. The plague, in its horror, planted the seeds of a new age. But at the time, no one could see that. They only saw the bodies, the smoke, the emptiness. At night, the survivors sat by their fires, listening to the silence outside. They whispered prayers for those they'd lost, but also for themselves, because guilt weighed heavy. Why them? Why had they lived when others hadn't? Every cough, every chill, every ache brought terror that the sickness had returned. Even years later, when the plague had faded, fear remained deep, invisible, inherited. It lingered in the way people avoided crowds, in the way they watched the horizon for signs of strange ships. The world had learned that death could come from nowhere and everywhere at once. For the church, the plague was a test and a failure. Faith wavered. People had prayed, begged, and whipped themselves bloody, and still the dying didn't stop. Many began to doubt. Why would God destroy the innocent? Why would priests die before sinners? The old certainty cracked, and in those cracks, new ideas began to grow, slow, dangerous, revolutionary. But that would come later. For now, there was only the silence after the storm. Imagine standing in a field once full of life crops. Birds, laughter, now quiet, save for the wind. The air is still heavy, the ground uneven from hastily dug graves. A single cross leans crooked in the soil, its shadow stretching long in the evening light. You can almost hear the echoes of what was the sound of a plow, the ring of a bell, a child's voice calling from a doorway. But it's all memory now. The world hasn't ended, but it no longer feels alive. The plague had not only killed bodies, it had killed innocence. The belief that life was stable, that tomorrow would come, that God would always protect all of it, burned away in the fever of those years. People began to see death not as a stranger, but as a neighbor. It was in every home, every breath, every shadow. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a popular image, painted on church walls and in manuscripts. Skeletons leading kings, peasants and priests, hand in hand, dancing together into the grave. It was both terrifying and comforting. Death had no favorites. It united everyone in the end. By the late 1350s, the plague had begun to fade, but it never truly disappeared. It came back again and again, smaller waves, quieter, but still deadly. Each time it returned, people remembered, and fear bloomed anew. But humanity, stubborn and resilient, kept rebuilding. Cities repopulated, trade resumed, and laughter slowly returned to the taverns. Yet beneath it all lay the memory of those dark years, the time when the world stopped breathing. You wouldn't have lasted long there. The smell alone would have driven you mad, the rot of bodies, the smoke of burning clothes, the constant incense of funerals. The fear would have broken your heart, to watch your family fall one by one, to bury them with your own trembling hands, to never know if you'd be next. There was no comfort, no medicine, only resignation. People didn't ask if they would die, only when. And still, somehow, they found beauty. In songs sung softly at night, in the kindness of neighbors who shared bread, in the sight of dawn breaking after another sleepless night. Humanity didn't vanish with the plague. It suffered, it wept, it prayed, but it endured. The Black Death taught people that life was fragile, and that made it sacred. When you think of the Middle Ages, you might imagine knights and castles, but the truth is quieter, sadder, more human. It's the story of those who lived through horror and still chose to keep living. Their world was dark, diseased, and cruel, but it was also alive with the small, stubborn light of survival. And when the last bell finally stopped ringing, when the last grave was filled, the survivors looked at the empty streets, and knew one thing for certain: the world would never be the same again. In medieval Europe, faith wasn't a choice. It was the air you breathed, the shadow you couldn't escape, the rhythm that guided your life from the moment you were born until the day you were buried in consecrated ground. Religion didn't just shape your beliefs, it shaped your reality. You didn't wake up wondering if God existed, you woke up terrified that He was watching. Every cough, every storm, every bad harvest was seen as His will. The church was the bridge between you and salvation, and that bridge demanded obedience, money, and fear. You weren't free to question, and you weren't brave enough to doubt. The local church stood at the heart of every village, stone building that rose above the mud and thatch. Its bell, a voice that reached every corner of your life. The priest was both your guide and your warden. He spoke Latin during Mass, a language no one in the village understood, but everyone listened anyway because his words carried power. When he raised his hand and spoke of heaven, you felt small, sinful, and grateful all at once. The church told you that the world was a test, that your suffering was noble, and that questioning your fate was a sin. So you didn't ask why the Lord ate meat while you chewed stale bread. You didn't ask why your child died of fever while the priest's candles burned bright through the night. You simply bowed your head and prayed harder. Every Sunday, you walked miles through mud and rain to attend Mass. You wore your best clothes, though best meant a tunic with fewer holes, and you stood in the cold stone building for hours, surrounded by the smell of incense and wax. The priest's words were meant to comfort, but they also reminded you that hell was real and closer than you thought. The paintings on the walls showed devils with claws dragging sinners into fire. The sight of them made you clutch your rosary tighter. You didn't need to understand theology. Fear was enough. The church didn't just rule your Sundays, it ruled your calendar, your harvest, your marriage, even your thoughts. Tithes were another reminder of who truly owned your life. 1/10 of everything you earned or grew went to the church. If your harvest failed, if your animals died, you still paid. You gave because you feared the alternative, eternal damnation. The priest collected coins and grain, not with greed, but with divine justification. God sees your generosity, he would say, as you handed over your last sack of wheat. You wanted to believe him, because not believing meant risking your soul. There were no atheists in the Middle Ages, only believers, and heretics didn't live long. Confession was, perhaps, the most intimate and terrifying ritual of all. You knelt before the priest, trembling, and whispered your sins into the wooden screen. You confessed to stealing bread, to lying, to thinking lustful thoughts, because you were told even your mind could betray you. The priest would sigh, offer forgiveness, and assign penance, maybe prayers, maybe fasting, sometimes lashes. You accepted it because forgiveness was currency and guilt was your constant companion. You lived knowing you were never pure enough, never worthy enough, and that heaven was a prize too far to reach without suffering. The church also controlled knowledge. Books were rare, and only priests and monks could read them. Truth came not from experience, but from sermons. You learned that the earth was flat, that disease was God's punishment, that poverty was holy. Education wasn't your right, it was a danger. A peasant who read too much might start to question, and questioning was rebellion against divine order. The world was simple, and that simplicity kept it from breaking. You didn't need to understand the stars or the sea. You just needed to know your place beneath them. Fear was not just spiritual, it was physical. The church had ways of reminding you of its power. You'd seen people punished for blasphemy, whipped for missing mass, or branded as witches for nothing more than a strange birthmark or a whispered rumor. The Inquisition wasn't just a distant story. It was a warning. In some towns, heretics were burned in the square while crowds watched in silence, believing the flames cleansed the soul. You stood there too, clutching your child's hand, trying not to look, but knowing you had to. Fear kept everyone obedient, and obedience, they said, was the path to heaven. Despite it all, faith gave comfort to. When your child was sick, when your crops failed, when your stomach ached with hunger, you turned to prayer. You lit a candle before a wooden cross and whispered into the silence, hoping someone was listening. Sometimes the candle burned out before you finished, and you took it as a sign. Sometimes it stayed lit longer, and that gave you hope. The church might have owned your soul, but in return, it gave your suffering meaning. It told you that this pain wasn't forever, that heaven waited for those who endured. That was enough to keep you going. At night, you lay in your straw bed and stared at the flickering shadows on the wall, replaying the priest's sermon in your head. You thought of the saints, of angels, of paradise beyond reach. You asked for forgiveness again and again, though you weren't sure what you'd done wrong. You prayed not to sin in your sleep, not to die unconfessed, not to be forgotten. And when you finally drifted off, it was to the sound of distant church bells echoing through the dark, reminding you that even in your dreams, God was watching. The medieval world was a place where every shadow had meaning and every misfortune carried a message. Sin wasn't just something you did, it was something that lived inside you, waiting to betray you when you least expected it. You were taught from birth that the devil watched you constantly, whispering temptations into your ear, hiding behind every thought that strayed from prayer. The church said he wanted your soul, and you believed it because sometimes you could feel it, the cold shiver in a dark room, the unease in your chest when you walked alone at night. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and filled with mysteries you couldn't explain, so you filled the silence with stories of demons and angels, of saints who performed miracles and sinners who burned for eternity. Every sickness, every failed harvest, every sudden death was a sign that sin had crept into the village. When a baby was stillborn or a cow stopped giving milk, no one blamed nature, they blamed evil. The devil's hand, they said, was everywhere. A black cat crossing your path, a strange dream, a neighbor's curse, all of it could mean something sinister. You learned to fear the unseen, to walk carefully through life as though the ground itself might judge you. There was no word for luck back then, only divine favor or divine punishment. If you suffered, you didn't ask, "Why me?" You asked, "What sin did I commit to deserve this?" Superstition ruled your days as much as faith did. You hung charms above the door to keep spirits away. You whispered blessings before stepping into the dark. You avoided certain woods because people said witches lived there, and witches in your world were real. They weren't the kind from fairy tales. They were neighbors who aged badly, midwives whose herbs worked too well, widows who talked to themselves by candlelight. The church told you the devil could take many forms, and you believed it because belief was safer than doubt. If you questioned too much, you might be accused next. There were prayers for every fear and rituals for every danger. If you saw lightning, you crossed yourself and prayed to Saint Barbara. If you heard thunder, you whispered a psalm. If your child had a fever, you made the sign of the cross on their forehead and placed a coin beneath their pillow to ward off evil spirits. These weren't games, they were survival. You lived in a world that made no sense, so you created patterns of control, little acts of faith that gave you comfort, even if they changed nothing. The church encouraged this fear, not because it was cruel, but because it kept order. A terrified people were obedient, and obedience meant stability. Priests preached that sin was everywhere, in laughter, in greed, in pleasure, even in curiosity. To question too much was pride, and pride was Lucifer's sin. You learned to stay small, to stay silent, to stay afraid. Fear was not weakness. Sit was wisdom. It kept your soul clean and your body safe. Or so you were told. Confession became your only relief. You might walk miles just to whisper your guilt through the wooden lattice to a tired priest who barely looked up. You confessed things that weren't even sin's bad thoughts, small lies, envy of your neighbor's ox. The priest would sigh and tell you to pray. You'd kneel for hours, repeating words you didn't understand, hoping God was listening. The guilt never left you, but at least it gave shape to your suffering. You began to believe that pain itself was holy, that to live in misery was to live in grace. And still, you feared the devil. You saw him everywhere, in the nightmares that woke you, in the sudden silence of a forest, in the faces of those who defied the priest. The idea of hell wasn't a metaphor, it was a destination as real as the field outside your door. The church's paintings made sure you never forgot it. Walls filled with twisted bodies burning in fire, demons with claws tearing at sinners. You saw those images every Sunday. You dreamed about them at night. When thunder roared, you thought it was God's anger. When you got sick, you thought it was punishment. The devil didn't need to appear to be real. He was already in your thoughts. People tried to protect themselves in strange ways. Some carried holy relics, a saint's tooth, a piece of the true cross, or what they believed was a feather from an angel's wing. Others tied herbs to their belts or drew strange symbols on their doors to confuse spirits. You never knew which ones worked, but it was better to try something than nothing. Fear had a way of creating faith, and faith had a way of giving fear meaning. Then there were the witch hunts. They started slowly with whispers. Someone's bread wouldn't rise. A cow died. A baby caught a fever on. Soon fingers pointed. A woman might be accused of using witchcraft simply because she was old or alone. The priest would visit, and if she couldn't recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling, that was proof enough. They said witches could fly, that they danced with demons in the forest. You'd seen no such thing, but when the mob gathered, you joined anyway, because being silent could make you a suspect too. It was better to shout with the crowd than to be the next one burned. The fear of witches wasn't about women, was about control. It reminded everyone that sin could live among them, that even your neighbor could be a servant of Satan. And yet, in the deepest parts of your mind, you sometimes wonder if God was truly good. Why did he allow so much suffering? Why did he let the innocent burn? But you quickly pushed those thoughts away, terrified that even thinking them was a sin. Doubt was the devil's whisper, and you had no desire to hear more. Nights were the worst. Darkness in the medieval world was not peaceful, it was alive. The moon was your only light, and every rustle outside could be a thief, a wolf, or something worse. You prayed before sleeping, crossing yourself again and again. You whispered the Lord's Prayer, asked for forgiveness, and hoped you'd wake to another dawn. Some nights you heard bells in the distance, tolling for a death somewhere nearby, and you shivered. You imagined the soul being weighed by angels and demons, judged for sins it didn't even know it had committed. You promised yourself to be better, to think less, to fear more. In time, fear became normal. It was stitched into your prayers, woven into your work, shared in every story told by the fire. You didn't even notice it anymore. It was just part of being alive. The church said fear was the beginning of wisdom, and so you accepted it, grateful for any kind of certainty in a world full of shadows. You didn't hope for peace on earth, you hoped for mercy in death. And yet, for all its darkness, the world still had beauty. The way sunlight hit the church steeple in the morning, the sound of a choir echoing through cold stone walls, the smell of incense rising toward the ceiling, it reminded you of something beyond pain. Maybe that was what faith truly was. Not understanding, not logic, but the stubborn belief that suffering had purpose. Even when everything hurt, even when life was cruel, you still believed heaven was waiting. That belief didn't erase the fear, simply gave it a destination. The medieval mind was haunted by eternity. Life on earth was short, brutal, and uncertain, but the afterlife was endless, and that made it terrifying. You could survive hunger, disease, and winter, but you could never escape judgment. Death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous. Every thought, every action, every sin was recorded by unseen hands, waiting for the day when your soul would be weighed against the will of God. You lived not for this life, but for the next, constantly balancing between salvation and damnation. Heaven was promised to the faithful, but no one ever truly knew if they had done enough to earn it. That doubt followed you like a shadow. The church taught that heaven was a paradise of golden light and eternal peace, a place where hunger, pain, and sorrow would vanish forever. The saints would greet you, angels would sing, and you would see God's face in all His glory. But they also said that very few would ever reach it. For most souls, the road led elsewhere, to purgatory, a realm of suffering, not eternal, but unbearable all the same. It was said to be a place of fire and waiting, where sins were burned away like rot from flesh. You could spend years, centuries, or even ages there, depending on how sinful you'd been. And hell. Hell was worse than any fire you could imagine. Eternal torment, endless screams, demons tearing at the souls of the damned. You didn't need to see it, to fear it. The paintings in the church were enough. Those images' faces twisted in agony, flames licking at naked bodies, burned themselves into your dreams. They weren't metaphors. To you, they were truth. You tried to live well, to obey the rules, but the rules were endless. Pride was a sin. Envy was a sin. Laziness, gluttony, anger, lustful sins. Even joy could be dangerous if it distracted you from God. You were told to be humble, patient, and grateful, even when starving. You were told to accept pain as a blessing suffering as a test. You were told that your body was weak, your soul corrupted, and your only hope was obedience. And so you obeyed. You confessed, you prayed, you gave alms to the poor, not out of kindness, but out of fear. You tried to think holy thoughts, but even those could betray you. Sometimes you wondered if heaven was even real or if it was just another promise to keep you quiet. But then guilt struck, and you begged forgiveness for even thinking such a thing. The church offered salvation, but it came at a price. You paid tithes every year, a tenth of all you owned. You bought candles to light before the altar. You gave coins to the priest to say prayers for your dead relatives, hoping it would shorten their suffering in purgatory. Wealthier families paid for entire masses, believing that the more people prayed for a soul, the faster it would rise to heaven. Even after death, money still had power. You couldn't bribe God, but you could buy his attention. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. They gave what little they could and prayed harder. Sometimes the priest told you that fasting or pilgrimage could help cleanse your sins. So you walked 4 weeks across dangerous lands to reach a shrine, barefoot and hungry, your feet bleeding on the stones. You did it because you believed every step could bring you closer to salvation. Death was never far away, and when it came without mercy. There were no doctors, no cures, no comfort except faith. When someone in your family fell ill, you called for the priest, not a healer. You wanted last rites, not medicine. The priest would arrive, mumble Latin prayers, and anoint the dying with oil, whispering words of peace. The dying person's eyes would stare past him, already seeing something no one else could. You hoped they went to heaven. You feared they went somewhere worse. And then the body was carried to the churchyard, wrapped in cloth. There was no coffin, no stone, just a wooden cross and the smell of damp earth. You watched the grave fill with soil and felt the weight of your own mortality pressing down on your chest. Life was fragile. Death was forever. The church said death was not to be feared. It was a passage, a doorway to God, but no one believed that entirely. The fear of hell was too strong, too vivid. Every sermon reminded you that one mistake could doom your soul forever. A single unconfessed sin could send you to the fire. People went to bed reciting prayers, desperate to die in a state of grace. Even sleep felt risky. You never knew if you'd wake again, and the thought of dying unprepared kept you trembling through the night. You wore crosses around your neck, kissed the Bible when you could, and clung to every ritual as if it could save you. Faith wasn't comfort, 'twas armor against despair. Sometimes you dreamed of heaven, though not the way the priests described it. You imagined a quiet place without hunger, without work, without pain, a field of sunlight where you could finally rest. You didn't care about gold or angels. You just wanted peace. But you also knew that peace was earned through pain, and pain was your only constant companion. The church called this the way of salvation, to suffer now so you might rejoice later. You didn't argue, you just endured. Purgatory became your greatest fear and your greatest hope. It meant you weren't damned, but you weren't saved either. You were trapped between the two, burning, waiting, weeping. Priests said prayers could shorten your time there, so you made sure to leave instructions for your family. Pray for me, light candles for me, give to the poor for my soul. Even in death, you depended on the living to help you find peace. You imagined yourself in that gray, smoky place, looking up at a distant light that never came closer. You hoped your children would remember you. You hoped God would notice you. The church's power came from that fear. It offered certainty in an uncertain world. If you followed the rules, confessed your sins, and gave what you could, then maybe, just maybe, you would be saved. That maybe was enough. It kept you obedient, humble, and afraid. And yet, in your quietest moments, when no one was watching, when the world was still, you sometimes felt something deeper than fear, longing for forgiveness that wasn't bought or earned, but freely given. You wanted to believe that God saw your pain, that He understood, that He loved you despite your sins. That small flicker of hope was the one thing the church could never fully control. As the bells tolled across the village and the priest's voice echoed through the mist, you bowed your head once more. You didn't know if heaven waited or if nothing did, but you prayed anyway, because in a world ruled by fear, prayer was all you had left. It was the last bridge between you and eternity, the last whisper of peace before the darkness swallowed you whole. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, your body burning with fever, your throat swollen shut, and your skin covered in dark spots that ooze with pain. You try to call for help, but your voice cracks into silence. In the flickering light of a tallow candle, your family gathers around, you terrified, helpless, and praying. In the medieval world, sickness wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery, a punishment, and often a death sentence. Medicine was not about healing. It was about guessing, hoping, and surviving long enough for your body to save itself. Doctors, if they came at all, were feared almost as much as the illness. Their tools were crude, their theories ancient, and their cures often worse than the disease itself. The doctors of the Middle Ages were not healers in the way we imagine today. They were scholars of old Greek and Roman texts, repeating ideas that had already been wrong for over 1,000 years. They believed the body was controlled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you got sick, it wasn't because of bacteria or infection, it was because your humors were unbalanced. Too much blood, they said, caused fever. Too much bile caused anger. Too much phlegm made you lazy and weak. And to fix you, they didn't treat the cause, they treated the balance. They cut you open and let you bleed. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments in medieval Europe. If you had a fever, a doctor might open your veins with a razor and drain a cup or 2 of blood into a bowl. Sometimes they used leeches, placing the slimy creatures on your skin to suck out what they believed was the bad blood. You would grow pale and dizzy, your heart pounding, the world spinning, but they called it progress. To them, weakness meant the illness was leaving your body. If you died, it was God's will. If you survived, the doctor took the credit. Surgery was another nightmare. There were no anesthetics, no antiseptics, and no understanding of infection. Surgeons were often barbers, the same men who cut hair and trimmed beards. The red and white barber's pole that still stands outside shops today. It comes from this bloody history, the red for blood, the white for bandages. If you broke a bone, they would set it roughly and wrap it in dirty cloth. If you had an abscess, they'd cut it open with a knife heated in the fire. The pain was unbearable, and most patients either fainted or screamed, until their voices broke. Many didn't survive the shock or the infection that followed. But again, this was called healing. For most people, though, the doctor was a luxury. The poor couldn't afford one. Instead, they turned to village healers, wise women, herbalists, or sometimes even priests. These healers used herbs, charms, and prayers. Some remedies worked by accident. Others were pure superstition. A fever might be treated with a mix of crushed garlic, vinegar, and moldy bread, the mold, ironically, sometimes helping, much like early penicillin. But more often, people relied on faith rather than medicine. They hung crosses over their beds, prayed to saints known for healing, and hoped for miracles. To get sick in the Middle Ages was to stand on the edge of death with nothing but hope holding you back. Diseases moved through medieval towns like wildfire. Streets were filled with waste, animals roamed freely, and water sources were contaminated. The air stank of rot and human filth. Flies and rats thrived, spreading illnesses that no one understood. When plagues came, they came without mercy. The most infamous of all was the Black Death, the bubonic plague that struck Europe in the 14th century. It killed 1 in every 3 people. Entire villages disappeared, their fields left empty, their houses abandoned. The doctors who dared to treat the sick wore long black robes and strange beaked masks filled with herbs. They looked like death itself, moving from house to house. The beak was supposed to protect them from bad air, but it didn't. Many of them died too. Their bodies piled alongside the patients they tried to save. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it destroyed faith. People believed it was a punishment from God. Some whipped themselves in the streets, begging for forgiveness. Others blamed strangers, witches, or even the stars. The church offered prayers and processions, but no cure. Medicine failed, faith wavered, and fear ruled everything. Families locked themselves inside their homes, refusing to open the door even for their dying neighbors. Love turned to terror. Compassion vanished. The sick died alone, buried in mass graves without names. And yet, through all this horror, people kept searching for answers. They studied herbs, experimented with minerals, and wrote strange medical books filled with drawings of organs they didn't fully understand. Some progress was made by chance clean wounds, healed better than dirty ones. Fresh air helped with fevers, but these were small steps in a world drowning in ignorance. Healing was a matter of luck. A broken leg could kill you. A simple cut could become fatal. Even childbirth was a gamble. Women died every day, bringing new life into the world, and everyone simply called it God's will. The irony of medieval medicine was that it was full of ritual and confidence, but empty of truth. Doctors spoke in Latin, wrote in thick books, and wore fine robes to look wise, but they often made things worse. They believed what they had been taught, never questioning it. Knowledge wasn't about discovery, it was about obedience. And so, for centuries, people suffered under the weight of old ideas. The real cure for disease wasn't found in herbs or prayers. It was found in the courage to ask why. But that question wouldn't come until much later. For now, the sick continued to bleed, the dying continued to pray, and the living continued to fear the unseen hand of death that lingered in every corner of their world. As the candle burns low and the doctor's shadow fades across the wall, You can almost hear the slow ticking of time, a heartbeat of history that reminds you how fragile life once was. You would not have lasted a day in that world. Not against the pain, not against the fear, and certainly not against the cure. The year was 1347. It began quietly, with whispers from distant land ships arriving from the east, carrying goods, spices, and something else. No one knew it then, but death had come aboard, silent and invisible. The Black Death, as it would later be called, swept through Europe like a storm from hell. Within months, towns that had thrived for centuries were turned into graveyards. Streets that once echoed with the sound of merchants and children now fell into eerie silence. Dogs roamed freely, carts creaked under the weight of corpses, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the air. It wasn't a war, nor a famine, it was something worse. It was nature itself, turning against humanity. It started with small swellings, painful lumps that appeared under the arms or in the groin. People called them buboes. They grew dark and hard, filled with pus and blood. Fever followed, then vomiting, then black spots on the skin that seemed to bloom overnight. Within a few days, the victim's body shut down completely. They bled from their mouths and noses, their breath thick with the stench of death. Some said it was the wrath of God. Others whispered it was poison in the air. No one truly understood. They only knew one thing: once the sickness entered a home, it did not leave until everyone inside was dead. Doctors were powerless. Their treatments, bloodletting herbs and prayers, did nothing. The disease laughed at their efforts. In desperation, cities ordered that fires be lit in every street to cleanse the air. People carried bundles of herbs and flowers in front of their faces, believing the scent would protect them. That's how the nursery rhyme "Ring a Ring, O Roses" would later be born, a grim memory of the plague. But no herb, no fire, no faith could stop it. Even priests began to refuse the dying, afraid to catch the curse themselves. The streets were left to the rats and the crows, both thriving on the endless feast of the dead. In some towns, the death toll was so high that there weren't enough people left to bury the bodies. Gravediggers worked until they collapsed, digging massive pits to hold hundreds of corpses. Families threw their loved ones into these pits and fled, covering their mouths with cloth and whispering hurried prayers. The air was thick with the buzz of flies and the sweet, rotting scent of death. Entire neighborhoods vanished in weeks. Churches were full, not of worshippers, but of the dead stacked in rows. Bells tolled constantly, so often that people stopped hearing them. The sound of death had become part of life, and then came the panic. Some believed the world was ending. Others blamed outsiders, travelers, even their own neighbors. Rumors spread that wells had been poisoned or that witches had cursed the land. Violence broke out across Europe. Innocent people were dragged from their homes, accused of spreading the plague, and killed by angry mobs. Fear turned ordinary people into monsters. There was no logic, no mercy, only survival. When everything around you is dying, the line between faith and madness disappears. The rich tried to escape. Nobles and merchants fled to their country estates, hoping distance would save them. But death followed. The plague traveled on rats and fleas, hidden in the grain, the clothes, the ships. It spread faster than fear itself. No wall, no gate, no castle was safe. Even kings lost their families, even priests buried their own brothers, and the poor, trapped within the cities, faced the worst of it. They couldn't flee. They starved behind locked doors, too afraid to go outside, too weak to fight the disease within. For them, every breath was a gamble. By 1350, Europe was unrecognizable. The population had fallen by nearly half. Villages stood empty, their fields overgrown with weeds. Cats and dogs ruled the streets. Churches crumbled, and silence filled the air where laughter once lived. The survivors walked like ghosts, haunted by the memory of everything they had lost. Some said they could still smell the plague years later, that the earth itself remembered. The trauma carved deep scars into the soul of the continent, scars that would last for generations. But even after so much death, life found a way to return. Slowly, cautiously, people came out of hiding. They rebuilt homes, cleaned the streets, and buried their dead properly. The plague had changed everything. Labor became valuable because so few workers were left. Serfs demanded wages, and some even won their freedom. Old systems of power began to crack. The plague had killed millions, but it also shattered the chains of the old world, forcing people to see how fragile authority truly was. From the ashes of death, a new order began to rise. Still, the fear never fully left. Every cough, every fever, every strange smell in the air brought memories rushing back. The Black Death would return again and again in smaller waves for centuries. People learned to live with the shadow of it, knowing it could return at any moment. They prayed harder, built hospitals, and sought new knowledge, but they never forgot. The memory of those years lingered in paintings, in songs, in the hollow eyes of survivors who had seen too much. And as night falls over a medieval town, with only the sound of distant bells and the faint smell of smoke, you can imagine standing there, looking down a narrow, empty street where death once walked openly. You can almost feel it in the cold wind brushing against your face, reminding you that no one, not even kings or priests, could escape it. In that world, survival wasn't about strength or faith, it was about luck. And if you had lived then, you would have prayed for that luck every single day. In the long shadow left by the Black Death, Europe was a continent haunted by its own fragility. The plague had stripped away illusions of control and revealed the raw truth of medieval life, that the line between life and death was as thin as a whisper. People had watched the most powerful men in their towns crumble like anyone else. Kings died beside beggars. Priests died. Doctors vanished before they could finish their cures. The survivors were left with one question echoing in their minds: why? But asking why in the Middle Ages was dangerous. Curiosity could be mistaken for heresy, and heresy could cost you your life. The Church held the keys to knowledge, and for centuries it had taught that sickness was a punishment from God, not a natural event. To question that belief was to question God Himself. So people prayed, confessed, and hoped that their suffering would cleanse their sins. But somewhere in quiet corners of monasteries and dimly lit studies, a few brave souls began to doubt. They weren't rebels, at least not at first. They were healers, monks, and scholars who started observing instead of only believing. They noticed that illness spread from person to person, that clean air and fresh water seemed to help, and that wounds healed better when washed. They began to see patterns, and from those patterns, a new kind of thought began to emerge, something that would one day be called science. Still, in those days, knowledge was a dangerous weapon. The church controlled education, and the old medical teachings of Galen and Hippocrates were treated as sacred texts. If you suggested that those ancient ideas were wrong, you weren't just challenging science, you were challenging faith itself. Many early physicians tried to balance both. They wrote cautiously, mixing observation with piety, always giving credit to divine will. God heals, they would say, but through the wisdom He allows us to learn. It was a delicate dance between reason and religion, and not everyone survived it. Some who strayed too far were labeled heretics. Women, in particular, suffered most. The wise women and herbal healers who had once been trusted were now viewed with suspicion. When medicine failed, fear turned to blame, and many of these healers were accused of witchcraft. Entire villages burned women alive for simply knowing how to mix herbs or deliver babies. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, was destroyed by fire and superstition. And with each burning, another piece of human understanding turned to ash. But there were others, silent thinkers, who persevered behind the veil of faith. In monasteries, monks copied ancient medical manuscripts by candlelight, preserving what little was known. They experimented with herbs in gardens, creating early versions of medicines. They learned that honey soothed wounds, that mint eased pain, that certain stones could purify water. It was not yet modern medicine, but it was a beginning. Meanwhile, in the great cities of the Islamic world, in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars had already advanced far beyond Europe. They studied anatomy, built hospitals, and translated works of Greek and Roman doctors into Arabic. They experimented, observed, and shared their discoveries freely. When their books eventually reached Europe, centuries later, they would spark a revolution. The turning point came slowly. Universities began to rise across Europe, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and with them came new curiosity. Young scholars dissected animals, studied human bones, and took notes, not from priests, but from the world around them. They still prayed before every lesson, but their eyes had started to open. The human body was no longer just a vessel for the soul. It was a machine, complex, fragile, and worth understanding. For the first time in centuries, the idea of studying life to protect it began to take root. But change in the Middle Ages came at the speed of fear, slow, hesitant, and painful. When doctors suggested that disease might spread through contact or unclean air, they were mocked. When they spoke of hygiene, people called them paranoid. When they dissected bodies, some called it blasphemy. Knowledge was not embraced, it was endured. Every discovery came with the risk of punishment. Still, small groups of thinkers persisted, sketching human muscles in secret, writing treatises on anatomy that wouldn't be printed for another 100 years. You can imagine one of them now, a scholar alone in his cold, stone room, ink-stained hands trembling as he copies a forbidden text. He listens for footsteps, afraid the church will find him. A candle flickers beside him, its flame dancing like the fragile spark of progress. He doesn't know it yet, but his quiet rebellion will one day lead to the Renaissance, to hospitals, to vaccines, to everything we take for granted. For now, though, he works in silence, surrounded by fear, The tragedy of medieval medicine was not just its failure to heal bodies, it was its fear of healing minds. It took centuries for people to realize that faith and knowledge were not enemies, but allies. The church had tried to protect souls by controlling thought, but in doing so, it had trapped generations in darkness. The healers and the heretics were the ones who struck the first cracks in that wall, fragile but unbreakable. And so, as night falls over the medieval world, you can almost hear the scratching of quills on parchment, the whisper of prayers, and the heartbeat of a new idea struggling to live. From blood and plague, from superstition and fear, a spark of light was born, a light that would one day become modern medicine. But in those centuries of ignorance, that spark was fragile, trembling, and always at risk of being snuffed out by the very people it tried to save. You would not have lasted a day in that age, not against the disease, nor the ignorance that fed it. But if you had lived, perhaps you would have been among the few who looked at the suffering around you and whispered the most dangerous word of all: why? Imagine opening your eyes at dawn in a tiny, smoke-filled hut. The air is thick, damp, and smells of wet hay and sweat. You lie on a bed of straw beside your family, your wife, your children, maybe even your animals. The rooster outside hasn't even crowed yet, but you're already awake. You can hear the distant church bells calling the village to life, a slow toll that reminds you who owns your time, your land, and your life. You are a serf, not a slave, but not free either. You belong to the land, and the land belongs to your Lord. Everything you touch, everything you grow, every breath you take exists under his shadow. In the medieval world, freedom was a luxury for the few. The great lords and nobles ruled over vast estates, while the peasants, the lifeblood of the land, worked endlessly to keep them alive. You tilled the soil from sunrise to sunset, planting and harvesting crops you would never truly own. A portion of every grain, every vegetable, every animal was owed to your Lord as rent. Another portion went to the church as a tithe. What remained, if anything, was yours to feed your family. You worked until your hands split open, until your back bent permanently, until you could barely stand. And when winter came and food ran low, you prayed, because prayer was all you had left. The Lord's manor towered over your village, a constant reminder of your place. It wasn't just a house, it was power carved into stone. From its high windows, the Lord could look down on the world and see every field, every hut, every life that belonged to him. You, on the other hand, could never look back. To speak against your Lord was treason. To refuse his orders was rebellion. You owed him labor, loyalty, and obedience, 3 chains that bound you tighter than iron. He could take your crops, your animals, even your children to serve in his house or army. And if you died, your family would owe him a tax just to bury you in consecrated ground. Yet somehow, the system endured, not because it was fair, but because it was all anyone had ever known. The church said that God himself had created this order: kings above lords, lords above peasants, and peasants above nothing. The meek shall inherit the earth, the priests preached, but not yet. For now you were to obey, to suffer, and to wait for your reward in heaven. And so you bowed your head, crossed yourself, and went back to work. Faith dulled the pain of injustice. Fear made sure no one questioned it. your days were a blur of labor. In spring, you plowed with wooden tools, following an ox that moved slower than your patience. In summer, you harvested under the brutal sun, the sweat dripping into your eyes. In autumn, you gave your Lord his share and your priest his due. Winter was a different kind of cruelty, long, cold, and silent. You huddled by a fire that barely warmed your bones, mending what tools you could and praying the grain would last. Hunger was your constant companion. When you had food, you were grateful. When you didn't, you told yourself that suffering made you holy. The village itself was small, a cluster of huts around a muddy road, with the church in the center like a silent guardian. Everyone knew everyone else, and gossip was the only entertainment. Marriages were arranged, lives were short, and ambitions were dangerous. No one dreamed of rising above their station, because the system was designed to crush such dreams before they grew. Education was for priests and nobles. You couldn't read, couldn't write, and had never seen a book. The world beyond your village might as well have been another planet. For you, life began and ended in the same patch of earth, the same soil you worked, the same soil that would one day cover your grave. Punishment was swift and brutal. A thief might lose a hand, a liar a tongue, and a rebel his life. Justice belonged to the Lord and was carried out in his courtyard. If you were lucky, you'd only be whipped. If you were unlucky, your body would hang from the gallows as a warning to others. The Lord's soldiers enforced his rule, armored men who rode through the village like living gods. To you, they seemed untouchable, creatures of iron and arrogance. But they too were bound by the same cruel hierarchy, serving someone higher, richer, and more ruthless. In the medieval world, no one was truly free, and yet, amid all this hardship, there was still life. On feast days, when the church allowed rest, the village came alive. Music, dancing, laughter, brief moments of joy that reminded you what it felt like to be human. You drank ale, shared bread, and forgot, if only for a night, the weight of your chains. Children ran through the fields, their laughter echoing against the wind. For a moment, even the poorest peasant could look up at the sky and feel something like peace. But when the bells rang again, the dream ended, and the endless cycle resumed. To be a serf was to be invisible, a life lived for others, measured not in years but in harvests. You would never own land, never hold power, never see your name written down. But without you, the kingdom would starve. You were the foundation of everything, and yet you were treated as nothing. And so you kept working, because there was no other choice. In that world, survival wasn't about strength or rebellion. It was about endurance. As the candle flickers low and the wind rattles your wooden door, you realize that this life, the endless toil, the submission, the quiet suffering, would have broken you long before your body failed. You wouldn't have lasted a day, not because of hunger or pain, but because of the hopelessness that came with knowing you were born to serve, and nothing could ever change that. In the medieval world, the law was not a shield, it was a sword, and that sword always swung downward. The lord of the manor was not merely your ruler, he was the living embodiment of justice itself. His word could condemn or pardon, destroy or protect. In a world where most men couldn't read or write, the spoken decree of a noble was as powerful as scripture. It didn't matter whether you were right or wrong. What mattered was your place in the order. And if your place was beneath him, your truth meant nothing. Justice, in those days, was less about fairness and more about control. Every village, every small town, and every kingdom had its own version of the law, but all roads led back to one principle: obedience. You obeyed your lord, your priest, and your king, not because you trusted them, but because you feared what would happen if you didn't. Disobedience was the gravest sin, not against God, but against order, and order was sacred. The church blessed it, the nobles enforced it, and the peasants suffered under it. When crimes were committed, the punishments were designed not to correct, but to terrify. The stocks in the village square were never empty. Their thieves were locked for days, left to bake in the sun or freeze in the cold, while neighbors mocked and spat at them. For worse crimes, justice turned theatrical. Public whippings, mutilations, and executions were not just punishments, they were entertainment. The gallows stood tall, a symbol of authority carved against the sky. Children watched as criminals swayed in the wind, learning the lesson their parents whispered every night: do not cross the Lord, do not question the church. The laws themselves were twisted webs of feudal privilege. If a noble killed a peasant, it was a tragedy. If a peasant killed a noble, it was treason. A poor man might hang for stealing a loaf of bread, but a baron could raid a village, take what he pleased, and call it duty. But you could be fined for fishing in the Lord's stream, punished for cutting wood from his forest, or even beaten for gathering herbs on his land. The earth itself belonged to him, and so, by extension, did everything that grew upon it. Even court sessions were rare, and justice was slow. The Lord would sit in his hall, surrounded by guards, as the villagers knelt before him to plead their cases. The air was cold, the stone walls echoed with their fear. There were no lawyers, no appeals, no mercy. The Lord listened when it amused him, and ignored what bored him. Sometimes he'd pass judgment while drinking, his words slurred, his temper sharp, and whatever he said became law. It wasn't about evidence, it was about authority. Truth was not something you proved, it was something he decided. Even the church, which preached compassion, had its own version of cruelty. To sin against God was to sin against the system. Confession was mandatory, penance was demanded, and forgiveness was always conditional. You paid in coins or in suffering. If you couldn't afford absolution, you fasted, you prayed, you bled. The priests held as much power as the nobles, for they ruled your soul, while the nobles ruled your body. Between them, there was no escape. You were trapped, spiritually and physically, in a cage built of fear. Torture was a language the powerful understood well. It was used to extract confessions, to prove guilt, to maintain terror. Iron devices, wooden racks, thumbscrews, tools of persuasion. The logic was simple. A man in pain doesn't lie. But pain doesn't reveal truth, it only silences it. In the dungeons beneath castles, men screamed prayers that no one heard. The walls absorbed their agony, and the church called it justice. The worst part wasn't the brutality, it was the belief that it was righteous, and yet the people accepted it. They had to. The law was said to be born from divine will. To challenge it was to challenge God himself. Peasants prayed for fair lords, good harvests, and kind priests, but they never prayed for freedom. Freedom was a dangerous idea, one that had no place in a world held together by fear. The system was cruel, but it was stable, and stability was sacred. You might be whipped, you might be robbed, you might be starved, but you knew your place. And knowing your place meant surviving another day for the Lord's. Justice was not just about maintaining power, it was about spectacle. Every act of punishment was a performance meant to remind the people who held the whip. The gallows, the stocks, the scaffold, these were the stages of authority. The crowd would gather, murmuring prayers or holding back laughter, as the condemned knelt before the blade or rope. The executioner, faceless and efficient, swung his weapon not out of hatred, but out of duty. And when the deed was done, the blood soaked into the dirt, feeding the same earth that would grow the next season's wheat. The law was not written for mercy. It was written for control. It existed to preserve a hierarchy so ancient that even the victims began to defend it. You could hate your Lord, but you couldn't imagine life without him. You could curse his name in private, but in public you bowed your head and thanked him for protection. The irony was cruel. The people loved the very system that crushed them because it gave them certainty. And in a world full of chaos, certainty was worth more than freedom. So the wheels of feudal law kept turning slow, heavy, and unyielding. Each judgment, each punishment, each prayer was another stone added to the fortress of oppression. And inside that fortress, humanity was caged. You could live there, you could even laugh there, but you could never escape. The lords ruled the land, the church ruled the mind, and together they ruled time itself. Everything moved according to their will. And as you close your eyes, imagining yourself in that cold, torchlit hall, kneeling before a Lord who sees you as nothing more than dust beneath his boots, you realize something chilling. You wouldn't just fail to survive this world. You'd fail to understand it. Because in the medieval age, survival wasn't about strength or rebellion. It was about submission. The law didn't protect you. It defined how much suffering you were allowed to endure before you broke. The end of the Middle Ages did not come with a bang, but with a slow, aching sigh. For centuries, the feudal order had held Europe in a vice of obedience and fear. Lords ruled the land, peasants served, and the church watched over all. But even the strongest chains eventually rust. By the late medieval period, cracks began to appear in the system that once seemed eternal. The same soil that peasants had worked for generations began to tremble beneath their feet. Not from war or plague this time, but from change. It started quietly, as all revolutions do. Trade began to grow. Small towns, once nothing more than dusty clusters of huts, turned into bustling markets. Merchants replaced knights as the symbols of wealth. Gold, not loyalty, became the new measure of power. With every coin exchanged, the world shifted a little. Peasants began to realize something dangerous, that money could buy more than bread. It could buy freedom. Some bought their way out of servitude. Others fled to the growing cities, where the Lord's hand couldn't reach. The towns offered anonymity and opportunity to things the countryside had never known. The lords, once mighty and unshakable, began to feel their grip weaken. Wars became costlier, armies harder to feed. The Black Death had already thinned the population, leaving fewer peasants to work the fields. For the first time, labor had value. A peasant could demand better conditions or threaten to leave a thought unthinkable a century before. The feudal pyramid built on endless supply and blind obedience, began to tilt. Power was no longer inherited through birth. It could now be bought, sold, or seized. The church, too, began to lose its sacred armor. For centuries, it had been the light of the world, but that light was dimming. Corruption, greed, and scandal had crept into holy halls. Indulgences were sold, confessions were taxed, and forgiveness had a price tag. When whispers of doubt spread through Europe, they grew into thunder. Scholars questioned the church's teachings. Thinkers rediscovered ancient knowledge, and artists painted humanity not as sinners, but as creators. The Renaissance was dawning, a rebirth of curiosity and courage that would pull the world out of the medieval shadow. But before the light, there was chaos. Peasant uprisings shook the countryside. Men who had spent their lives bowing their heads suddenly raised them in anger. They marched with tools instead of swords, demanding justice, food, and dignity. Some burned manors, others attacked tax collectors, shouting that enough was enough. Yet most of these revolts ended in blood. The lords retaliated with iron and fire, crushing rebellions, one after another. But though the bodies fell, the idea did not die. Every peasant who was hanged left behind a whisper that would echo for centuries. We are not born to serve. By the 15th century, Europe was unrecognizable. Kingdoms had become nations, swords had given way to trade, and the old order was collapsing under its own weight. Feudalism, once the beating heart of society, was now a relic. The rise of the printing press spread knowledge faster than fear. Education, once forbidden to commoners, began to slip through the cracks. Books taught people to think, and thinking taught them to question. The mind, once bound by faith and fear, began to stretch its wings, and yet the cost of this change was immense. Generations had lived and died believing that the world could never be different. To tear down the structure that had defined their existence was terrifying. For many, freedom felt like falling, because when the Lord's power vanished, so too did his protection. Wars between kingdoms turned into wars between nations. Power shifted from castles to crowns, from lords to monarchs. The poor were still poor, but the idea that they could rise, that they could learn, that they could matter, that was new, and it was unstoppable. The last echoes of the feudal world faded slowly. The manor fields turned quiet, overgrown with weeds. The gallows in the village square stood empty. The church bells still rang, but their sound no longer commanded obedience, only memory. The peasants' grandchildren now worked in towns as craftsmen, traders, and sailors. Their names were still unknown to history, but their footsteps marked the path to modernity. It's strange to think that a system which lasted nearly 1,000 years could crumble without a single defining moment. No one declared its end. It simply stopped working. The world grew faster, hungrier, and more curious than the feudal order could handle. Kings needed money, merchants had it, and lords became irrelevant. Power had changed hands quietly, from sword to coin, from birthright to ambition. And so the age of the peasant faded into legend, remembered only in the stories of dusty chronicles and fading manuscripts. But if you close your eyes, you can still feel it, the cold air of a dawn long past, the weight of a hoe in calloused hands, the sound of bells echoing across the fields. The life of a medieval serf was short, brutal and hopeless, yet it built the foundations of everything we have today. The roads, the cities, the very idea of work, all born from their suffering. When you think of freedom now, the ability to speak, move, or dream, remember that, for most of history, such things were unthinkable. They were luxuries paid for by generations who lived and died without ever tasting them. The medieval world was cruel, yes, but it was also necessary. Without it, there would be no awakening, no progress, no future. Sometimes, humanity must crawl through darkness before it learns to walk in light. And as you drift toward sleep, imagine standing on that threshold between the world of chains and the dawn of freedom. The sky above Europe is no longer filled with smoke, but with light. The bells ring again, not for mass or labor, but for change. The age of the Lord is ending. The age of man is about to begin.